Welcome to Transformative Principle, where I help you stop putting out fires and start leading. I'm your host, Jethro Jones. You can follow me on Twitter at Jethro Jones. Welcome to Transformative Principle. I am your host, Jethro Jones. You can find me on all the social networks at Jethro Jones. I'm so excited to have on the program today Kurtis Hewson, who is an award-winning former administrator and teacher, as well as teaching faculty at the post-secondary level. He's the co-founder of Jigsaw Learning and co-author of the book, Collaborative Response, 3 Foundational Components that Transform How We Respond to the Needs of Learners. And he currently works with districts and schools nationally and internationally, establishing collaborative response frameworks and interacting with thousands of educators. I'm really excited for this conversation because we're going to dive into what collaborative response is versus RTI and MTSS, which many of you have heard about, but you probably don't know much about collaborative response. So this is going to be a great introduction to that to you, but it is just that, an introduction, and there's a lot more to it, deeper layers. And so you'll definitely want to check out Kurtis's website and blog and podcasts as well. Kurtis, thanks so much for being part of Transformative Principles today. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Jethro. Really excited to engage in this conversation with you.
Yeah. So what was most valuable from our conversation today?
To me, I think it's just thinking really intentionally about how we create structures and systems to engage and really align the practices, the teaching, and the staff teams within our building in direct connection and alignment with the tiers of support that we establish. When we can create that alignment and coherence within our schools, and even more importantly, within our greater jurisdictions or systems, we have such better ability to maximize the expertise of the entire team and ensure success for all students.
I agree. That was powerful. The other thing I would add is the process by which you go about building a collaborative culture is so important. And we're going to talk just a little bit about that. And I think that idea just is incredibly powerful, that besides just being collaborative, which is obviously essential, you also have to name it and identify it at the appropriate time and in the appropriate way. And we're going to touch base on that. So we're going to get to my interview here with Kurtis in just a moment. So, Kurtis, I think the best place to start is with this idea of collaborative response and how that is different from response to intervention or multi-tiered systems of supports, which I think most people are probably familiar with.
Yeah, you bet. So collaborative response, it's really 3 foundational components that come together. How do we set up collaborative structures and processes within our school? How do we then utilize data and evidence to inform the conversations in those structures? And then how do we develop a continuum of supports that is tiered? So some of the primary delineations that we see that differs a little bit from some of the more traditional response to intervention or multi-tiered systems of supports is the idea that within that continuum, we tier the supports, not the student. So for instance, there's no such thing in our minds as a tier 2 student. There's a tier 2 set of supports that we can put in place. The other thing that within this collaborative response framework that we do is establish 4 tiers. And this isn't about adding one more tier to the top of a traditional 3-tiered system. It's about taking tier 1 and breaking it apart to be able to identify that within that universal, what is happening in the classroom, we break it into 2 to be able to say at tier 1, what are the non-negotiables that will happen across every classroom, across our entire school, ensuring that there's coherence and fidelity. And then tier 2 become the supports put in place for some students, some of the time, in some classrooms, but still by the classroom teacher. So that's where we really clearly articulate what is the differentiated practices, the interventions, accommodations, and strategies we could be putting in place before we ever look at what's the next tier, which is then tier 3 of supports provided by someone other than the classroom teacher, and then tier 4 supports provided by someone external to the school. So it's through doing this and then having teams that are aligned at each tier, that we really see not only a response for students, but it's done so in a collaborative way that's building everybody's capacity. And prior to putting some of these systems in place, Jethro, we found within our schools, sometimes as students were moving, and in a sense, we were tiering the kids, it was as they moved from one tier to the next, it was almost like a person could say, well, it's moved to somebody else's responsibility now, not mine. But when we're tiering the supports, everybody has responsibility. And even when we are putting our most intensive supports in place, it's built upon a foundation of what's happening with robustness back at the classroom level. So that was a bit of a quick rundown of something that's fairly complex to be able to put it all together and see the differences between what we share in collaborative response and some of the other different response frameworks.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate that, Curtis. And I like the idea that we tier supports, not students. And can I have more questions about the different tiers and all that? But let's start by taking that approach first, because when we change the focus of what we're doing and how we do it, it makes a difference. And so, one of the things that I say all the time is that school is not designed for our students, it is designed to make life easy for the adults. And that has an impact on how we run our schools and what it means to be in a school.
Absolutely.
But when a school is designed for the students, then it changes our focus and makes us think differently about what it is that we are providing to the students and how they're involved and all that kind of stuff. So talk to me more about this idea of tiering supports and not students, and how do you not fall into that kid is tier 2, tier 3, etc. all the time?
Absolutely. So again, it may seem like just a subtle difference when we say Jethro's not a tier 3 student. Jethro is a student who currently needs tier 3 supports in a particular area. It's massive when it comes to mindset. When we're tiering the students, sometimes it's what is the student doing that becomes a responsibility. It may not be reflecting upon, is the student needing the extra support because of what I'm doing as an adult? And when we tier those supports, then I do think it really puts the attention on, yes, this is a concern, but what are we doing for it? So when we go and work with schools to build out their continuums of support, we are clearly articulating what are all the things that we could be doing for student success within the classroom and beyond. And then we really want to ensure, have we exhausted our possibilities at each tier before we look at adding the next layer of support at a subsequent tier? So the idea that when a student is needing tier 3 supports, it's already built on a strong foundation of tier 1, what we would have in place for every student, and then tier 2, all the differentiated supports that we can put into place. And when we clearly articulate that continuum, it helps us to reflect on, but what have we done at the classroom level to support this student before we ever look beyond the responsibility of the classroom? So Jethro, it really does do exactly what you said. It puts the attention on what are we doing for the kids, for our students, for our learners' success, and really ensures a practice of reflection ongoing from an individual teacher and from a system perspective as well.
So with that idea, then how does it change the idea of the responsibility for student success? And saying like, oh, this kid's not doing well here, so now it is somebody else's responsibility to take care of that student. How does this approach help the right people be in charge of the student's success?
Yeah, you bet. So we often say that, students, well, human beings have jagged profiles. And this is why when we engage in collaborative response, one of the first questions we ask is, what's a priority we're trying to improve within our school? So let's take a simple example and say literacy is a area that we are trying to impact. We would then go and articulate what are all the things that we do in the area of literacy to support students and tier them according to that little bit of criteria that I gave earlier. And then we want to be able to say, all right, when we're coming together into a structure we refer to as the collaborative team meeting, we're identifying what are we doing at the classroom level, and it's teachers who are together saying, have you tried this? What about this? Here's an idea that we could try, so that in that particular conversation, everybody's capacity is being built as people are sharing toolboxes. We're referring to our continuum. We're adding to that continuum through those conversations and putting in place what could we do at that classroom level. Then by the time we say, all right, we've put all of these supports in place, but we're still not seeing student success, then we initiate the conversation at the next collaborative structure in alignment with tier 3. We refer to it as the school support team, which within my own case, it involved some of our learning support personnel, the administration, and then some of our wellness support individuals. And we would say, all right, now what do we need to do in addition to what's happening for the students? So the student becomes our responsibility. And by our, I mean not just those that are interacting at the classroom level, but others with expertise across the school. But it ensures that there's not that handoff from a generalist to a specialist. We're all involved for this student's success on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, and that sounds great in theory, but
Yeah.
how does that work in practice? Because that's where the rubber really hits
Yeah.
the road, right? We say that kind of stuff all the time in education, and then we just don't follow through with it. And so what does that look like in practice? How do you ensure that everybody does feel like the success is their responsibility?
Yeah, and this is where that alignment with the collaborative structures and processes becomes so key here, Jethro. So being able to identify within our school layers of team that are established, and we talk about these 4 layers that should exist in any school, whether you're a school of 3,000 students or 30, with some of our smaller rural schools that we have here in Alberta. And these 4 layers of team, the first layer is what we refer to as collaborative planning, the opportunity for teachers to be coming together to share practices, not necessarily looking at individual students, but looking at the overall practices that we're putting in place. So a school that's engaging in some strong professional learning communities work, or we've seen schools utilizing Simon Breakspear's sprint model, where we're determining what could we do that we think will impact all students and build that into our practice. So that becomes that first layer, and it really becomes the teacher team that holds one another accountable with, of course, admin involvement and oversight as well. That second layer is what I described very briefly before as the collaborative team meeting. And what it's intended to do is to be able to have teachers come with a student, but identify a key issue that we are experiencing. Then we add other students to that similar key issue, and then we brainstorm what could we do. Really, this is accessing and activating that tier 2 level of supports. And this is where we really see the learning and the true collaboration come into play. Then that third layer becomes the school support team. As mentioned, within my own school, it involved, I believe there were 4 of us on that primary team. This was a school of about 300 at the time. I've worked, of course, with much larger schools where they have multiple school support teams in place, but this is where we would determine what are the supports beyond the classroom that need to be activated. And then that fourth layer becomes what we refer to as the case consult. And that's really where we're looking at one student and really intentionally determining first who needs to be at the table for that conversation, and then what are the supports that we put in place that may involve individuals or agencies from beyond the school. So this is the part that becomes key in a collaborative response framework, is having a really succinct, layered set of structures that are happening on a regular basis. So there's obviously timetabling implications that come into play with this. And it's through those systems that we enable not just an ethos or a mantra of success for all, but we enact it and identify
Mm-hmm.
very succinct action plans and next steps and accountability that is put in place. We often describe that in collaborative response, it's simple in its premise, highly complex when you try and put it all together. It's generally not until a school's into that second year of exploration that, or not exploration, of establishing it, that you really start to see the cultural change happen. That's pretty critical for that collaborative, that
Yeah.
culture of
Okay.
collaboration.
We're going to come back to that culture of collaboration in just a
Yeah,
second.
you
But
bet.
first, you said that you bring a student to this collaborative team meeting and you talk about a key issue. What do you mean by a key issue? Talk a little bit more about that, and then we'll
Yeah,
get to the
you bet.
collaborative culture that's needed.
So I'll take one step back. And again, one of the primary questions is, what's an area that you are trying to impact within a school? And we see schools that have multiple priority areas over time, but we usually say start with one to get the framework, the structure, and the understanding in place. So let's assume that we've said, okay, we're focusing on really impacting, moving the needle on numeracy. So that's our focus for the collaborative team meeting. Now I come in and I've have Jethro. And Jethro, the key issue for me right now is the application of mental math strategies. He's learned all these different strategies for addition and subtraction, but I'm not seeing him apply them to new learning situations. So then what we say is, okay, the key issue is application of mental math strategies. And we say, does anyone else have a student where they're seeing that? What we're trying to do for this is take the attention off Jethro, the student, and off Kurtis, the teacher, to try and focus it in on the key issue. You know that if we focus in on one student and we found this, it opens itself up to venting, to going down rabbit holes. I've taught his sister, I taught his mother, all of those stories. And we also don't want to create a situation where everyone in the room is telling Kurtis, the teacher, this is what you should do. And now I'm really overwhelmed. So by establishing that key issue, then we say, who else? And now it becomes a conversation that could impact multiple students. And then we want to be able to say, all right, application of mental math strategies. What are some things we could do? Go. And we start brainstorming. We're also in time looking at our continuum of supports to see, are there ideas that we can take off that? And when one teacher says, well, I have an anchor chart that reminds students of the different strategies they can utilize. And when another teacher says, I do something like that, but I actually put the students' names on those anchor charts to help remember that this is Billy's strategy that he showed with, and this is Letitia's strategy. And we go through all that brainstorming, and then we come back and say, all right, Kurtis, the teacher, what's one thing that you're going to try from this for Jethro? And I identify my commitment, the one thing I'm going to try. Now, often when we first start this process, it's often things that are really within that person's wheelhouse or things that they were intending to try anyway. But over time, as we build up trust and vulnerability in that process, we see people start to stretch. We see people start to say, I really like your idea, but I'm not sure how to do that. I need some help. And we often say that collaborative team meeting environment becomes a space for distributive coaching. The idea that everyone is an expert, but everyone's a learner. And what can we learn from one another to just continue to build instructional capacity so that over time we see less and less students potentially needing those higher tiers of support coming into play. The collaborative team meetings, really a different way. It looks like you're talking about students, but really you're just using the students as a mechanism to leverage a conversation about practice on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that taking that approach is different than what we usually do. And I really like the idea of saying, what is the issue that a particular student is facing? And then who else is struggling with that? And how can we pull them together? Which is a small difference from how we typically think
Yeah.
about it, but powerful enough that that I see the distinction and see where it can be valuable.
And Jethro, with
So
that too, when somebody says, but I have this student and I can't narrow it down to one key issue, this is why the layers of team become important, because then we say, okay, well, let's move that conversation to one of our other layers.
yeah,
Then
yep, totally.
just how do you
Yeah.
establish that system of response?
Yeah, I like that. Okay, so let's talk about the collaborative culture that needs to exist because
Mhm.
this is so important. And the first thing that I've noticed from what you said so far is that teacher ego needs to get out of the way. And this is something that everybody has ego and thinks that nobody's doing an intentionally bad job. And so when when somebody is given feedback, it feels like they are being criticized rather than their idea, their strategy, whatever it is.
Mhm.
And that's a tough place for a lot of people to be. So how do you establish and create that collaborative culture?
That's a great question. And I often have the response of, well, I think we need to work on our culture before we can implement any of this work. And
Yes.
my response would be no, implement, and it's going to impact culture over time.
I could sense you going there, and I'm
Yeah.
so glad you said that because so many times we think we have to do all this work and we have to put all these processes and stuff in place first, and then we can do it. But no, your culture is what actually happens day to day, and those are the things that you need to do. And so it makes no sense to say this is what we're going to do and then not actually do it. You're just a liar at that point. It's so much more valuable to document the things that you're already doing and say, hey, this is how we act, everybody knows it, here's the documentation that shows this is how we act. It's also again a mind shift but a very different strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think by putting in things with it, let's use that collaborative team meeting, for example. As part of that, we want to have norms established. What are the agreements that we'll make to make these meetings as effective as possible? We're going to set timelines for it. Oftentimes, when people first see a collaborative team meeting, like a video clip from one of those, the first thing they notice is, oh my goodness, it's really structured. And our understanding through this over time, almost 2 decades of doing this now, is the structures are what allow us to start building that culture of that involves psychological safety, it involves trust, it involves vulnerability. And then we found, for instance, articulating what are the things we could do on our continuum of supports. Then when we come into a meeting and someone says, Jethro, have you tried this? We're not asking it because we're questioning your integrity or professional competence. We're asking because it's on our continuum. It makes it safe because we've determined or articulated these are all the things that we could be doing. And as we do that over and over, you build that culture that is so critical within this work. The idea as well is that no one in our profession has it completely figured out, but we all have areas of strength and expertise. So we see over time, especially in those collaborative team meetings, that I become more open to the suggestions and ideas of others because they're taking some of the ideas that I'm sharing out in areas of strength that vindicate what I'm doing within the room. Again, we often talk about the idea that we're going to establish that everyone is an expert, yet everyone is a learner, and reinforcing that over time. It just, you build the culture as you go, but it becomes one that has exceptionally high levels of collective efficacy, which we know is pretty critical to how we respond to students. When we have people feeling that they know they're having an impact and they can identify how they're doing, that's pretty powerful.
It really is powerful and so valuable. I'm so glad that we spent some time chatting about that idea. So the last question I have is, what is one thing that a principal can do this week to be a transformative leader like you, Kurtis?
I think it's recognizing that you don't have all the answers. No one is smarter than the room. So, how do we leverage the room, metaphorically, to bring out the best from us collectively? So, I would say the biggest thing is focus on your structures and your systems. And I can share with you, Jethro, to throw in the show notes, a simple guide that has just 5 ways you can transform meetings starting tomorrow. Simple things like, do you have norms established? Do you have roles? Who's going to do what to be responsible within the meeting? Do you have purposes established? And have you taken intentional time to celebrate what have you done and what has led to that success before moving into the next set of challenges? I think if anything I could say as my learning as a leader is the structures and systems are so critical for us achieving what we want to be able to achieve, which is success for each and every one of our students.
Absolutely. So you can get that in the show notes, 5 ways to transform meaning, and you can check that out. And then also there's a ton of great stuff on your website, jigsawlearning.ca, which is also linked in the show notes. And then people can also check out the book, Collaborative Response, 3 Foundational Components That Transform How We Respond to the Needs of Learners, which is your book that you published a couple of years ago. Such good stuff. Definitely check those out. The links are in the show notes at transformativeprincipal.org. And once again, Kurtis, thank you for coming on Transformative Principal. I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate being here as well, Jethro.